Also CNBC Washington Bureau Chief. Well, he is the CNBC Washington Bureau Chief, and Michael Duffy's Assistant Managing Editor of Time, which just this week named Barack Obama Person of the Year. Tough one, huh? Nail biter.
Right down to the wire.
And so that of the guy who ran the Beijing Olympics, I see. Well, let me ask you about this New York. Tell me, both you gentlemen, each in your own turn, give me an update of where this fight, it's the last real Senate fight to be contested this year by the electors, by voters. Minnesota, Al Franken versus Norm Coleman, the incumbent Republican. 341 votes separating them as they proceed through this examination by challenge of the recounted vote.
That's 3 or 4 more days. I guess they're going till Friday. And mostly what's left to count, Chris, are the ballots that have been challenged by Franken, that he thinks are erroneously cast for Norm Coleman. He's hoping to collect, he's 200 or 300 votes behind. He needs some percentage of those in order to change the outcome. That's a long shot. For a while, last week he thought he was closer. Turns out, after they've gone through some of the recount, he's not.
And there's more than 1,000 of those that he's challenging. Most of those could be counted eventually for Coleman, so he could fall further behind.
Right.
He could, but Democrats believe, there are counts, prospective counts that were made before the final ruling by the canvassing board. So these that represent the local officials' initial inclination as to whether to count those votes. It's kind of like the equivalent of, in football, the call on the field while they review it in the instant replay booth. Democrats believe that once all of those votes are actually accounted for by the canvassing board, if they go the way they expect, Franken is going to dramatically narrow that margin. We'll see if he can do it. He hasn't done it so far.
It's Minnesota, though, don't forget. 80 or almost 90% of the people voted. They're really good at voting. It's not like some of the other states where there are a lot of first-time voters, although there were a percentage in this case. If you ever had a perfect state where you're liable to have an almost perfect election, it is Minnesota. So
Teddy White wrote that back in 1960, the 19th election. He said some elections, you never quite know what the count means. In those days, Texas and Illinois were 2 prime examples. You could guess within 100,000 votes, you didn't know where they were really coming out. But he said in Minnesota, he may have mentioned Wisconsin as well, in those states, it's on the nail generally. You can assume that the vote's completely, utterly honest.
And one of the things,
that's a pretty nice thing to say about a state these days.
Well, it's definitely a good government state. One of the things that's going on in the jockeying, the legal jockeying right now, is to try to see if you can be ahead when the canvassing board certifies, or Secretary of State certifies the vote at the end of the week. There may be legal challenges after that, but history shows that usually the person ahead in the count prevails in those legal challenges. And so, for example, Republicans, Al Franken, Norm Coleman's petitioning the Supreme Court to stop the counting of some of these absentee ballots, knowing, though, they will probably be counted in the end, but they don't want them in the tally that is accounted at the end of this week.
Have I missed something? But neither of the candidates, Coleman, who's pretty well known, wasn't his brother a sports guy on Imus for years? I don't know. No, I'm Coleman, yeah. Or cousin, I'm sorry. But they're pretty well known. Neither one of them has made a sort of a national political appeal. They've sort of left this to the Minnesota process. Very clean. That's an interesting decision on their part.
They've raised a little money nationally to help pay for some of these legal bills.
But they're not going on the tube and making their case on programs.
And they've gotten along well. Their lawyers actually are talking there. It's actually been a fairly collegial Minnesotan kind of recount. And I think that's probably wise, because at the end of this process, it's gone on for so long. I suspect a lot of Minnesota voters aren't going to really want either of them to win.
It's actually been more collegial than the campaign itself.
It was.
John, is there any chance that the U.S. Senate, which is dominated by Harry Reid and the Democrats, will interfere? That will say, this is too close to call, so we're going to call it for Franken? Any chance that would happen?
Well, it could eventually get to the Senate if the legal challenges drag on, but I don't think that the Senate would go against whatever the final certified tally is. That's why the tally at the end of this week is so important.
So it's going to be decided in Minnesota. We'll be right back with John Harwood and Michael Duffy for more of the Politics 6. We're going to talk about Caroline.